Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to moderate this conversation. My name is Maddalena. I'm from the European Council on Foreign Relations. We're a think tank. This is the only panel at the Warsaw Security Forum dedicated to minerals and to Africa. And it touches directly on one of the most decisive questions for Europe's future security and autonomy, which is the control of mineral value chains. Minerals are not just commodities. They're the foundations of Europe's defense and competitiveness via technological development and supremacy. Fighter jets, satellites, missile systems, cyber infrastructure, all depend on a steady supply of critical minerals, and so do the clean energy systems that we are after, from solar panels to electric vehicles, digital technologies like artificial intelligence and so forth. They all underpin Europe's economic competitiveness and the ability to act strategically in a more contested world. Whoever controls these chains, these value chains, shapes who leads and who follows in the global economy and in security affairs. Today, China dominates these chains. Over the past 2 decades, it has secured near monopolies in the processing of minerals, such as rare earths, and has become an indispensable link between raw resources and the finished technologies that we all use. We've seen how this dominance can be used as leverage. Recent export bans made clear that minerals can be wielded as strategic tools and can become choke points that can disrupt entire industries. This reality has triggered a global race. On the one hand, you have industrial powers like Europe, but also Japan, the US, and many others, which are scrambling to diversify away from Chinese dominance and try and build more processing capacity. Europe is in a pretty vulnerable position at the moment. It has almost no mineral production and no processing capacity. It is looking at Africa and other regions to create new alliances. At the same time, you have producing countries, especially across Africa. Africa holds about 30% of global mineral reserves. These countries are determined to enter the power play. African governments want to move beyond being providers of raw materials. They want to benefit through local refining, processing, manufacturing, and so forth. This push reflects Africa's stronger voice on the global stage, but is constrained by infrastructure gaps, limited finance, deep governance challenges, even conflict in some areas, which complicates both domestic development and international deals. How can Europe and Africa help each other in this picture? We're here to unpack these questions and place them in a broader context, which is increasingly strained relations between Africa and Europe, shaped by mismatched expectations, uneven investment flows, contested narratives of partnership, and so forth, and a crisis of multilateral governance that leaves all actors navigating in a very fragmented and uncertain global order. So to explore these questions, I'm joined by an excellent panel. We have João Cravinho, EU Special Representative for the Sahel. Kayode Fayemi, former Minister of Mines and Steel Development from Nigeria, and James Kenny, co-founder and CEO of Frontier Rare Earths, a company headquartered in Europe with mining projects in Southern Africa. We were also expecting another panelist, Vera Songwe, who unfortunately could not join us. But we have a very nicely balanced mix of EU policy diplomacy, African leadership, and private sector perspectives. So let me turn immediately to Mr. Cravinho to start with a European perspective. So from a European perspective, what new risks does the surge in demand for critical minerals and Africa's centrality to it create for Europe, and what concrete steps can Europe take to mitigate these risks?
Well, thank you, Maddalena. Thank you all for being here. Let me start with a couple of framing points. The first one you already outlined, which is essentially that we are involved here in a global transition. We are in geopolitical competition for the same minerals. There is an upsurge in demand that is massive for lithium. The demand is increasing for 12 times between 2020 and 2030, 20 times up to 2050. For other critical minerals, we're seeing similar upsurges in demand. So very high demand, very severe competition for the same minerals. The second framing point is, and of course added to that, the centrality of Africa that you mentioned. The second framing point is that there is a demographic revolution in Africa which brings with it a profound sense of divergence with Europe, with the West, as a result of deep frustration at the failures of governance over the decades, which is blamed, of course, on previous governments. It's blamed on Europeans and Westerners and mining companies in many cases for having supported previous governments. This is the narrative. And I wanted to point that out because it goes very deep. You may say, well, it doesn't, the facts are somewhat different. Perceptions, as any politician knows, perceptions are fundamental. And there is a perception amongst the African youth, which is most of Africa, because 65% of Africans are under 25, 70% in the Sahel, believe that what Europeans have been doing in this field has been directly detrimental. So we are facing this reality and we have to take this on board. Of course, we have increasing risks. We have risks of structural vulnerabilities due to the possibility of interruptions of supply, coups, a number of factors that can happen. We have increased geopolitical transactionality, and that's where this point that I made comes into play, because it is not so difficult for geopolitical competitors to say, you know, why are you going with the Europeans on this or that? They have exploited you over the decades, and feeding into this narrative, into this idea, is something that is a source of vulnerability for us. And of course, there is the reputational risk. This reputational risk means that we have absolutely to be paying a lot of attention to transparency. We have to do whatever we can to promote global governance standards, best practices, and so on, because we are, I would say, more vulnerable to reputational risk than our competitors. So what can we do? 2 or 3 things that we can do. Diversification, obviously, diversification in Africa, diversification beyond Africa. This panel is about Africa, but I would say that it is vital also to be looking at Latin America. Chile has the world's biggest supply of lithium. The deal with Mercosur can open up new opportunities, but I don't want to be talking about Latin America. Inside Africa, I think we have to be establishing conversations in many different directions. We have to, one point that I would like to mention, I think that where we can gain a competitive advantage is if we are able to structure, it just takes time, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of technical expertise, mechanisms of mineral price stabilization that can give us a critical advantage come with us and you will have foreseeability. Go with the others and you will be open to volatility. Thirdly, the global governance standards that I've already alluded to, and the Critical Raw Materials Act, which is already in place, but offers interesting lines of reduction of risk through own production, through processing in Europe, through recycling. Those are the points that I'd like to bring to the table. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And let me turn immediately. I'll come back to you with follow-up questions. But let me go now to Minister Fayemi to touch upon a similar aspect. So foreign investment in Africa's natural resources, including minerals, have often led to export of raw materials with limited benefits on the ground, and also corruption, weakened institutions, and a number of issues that foreign investors find they're central when coming to Africa. Are African governments and societies better equipped to avoid these pitfalls today, or do you see the risk of repeating the same old extractivist patterns with all the new players in the mineral space?
Thank you, Maddalena, and thank you for having me at the Warsaw Security Forum. The story of foreign investment, particularly from Europe to Africa, has been one of paternalism, mostly, rather than partnership. And what has transpired over the last 2 decades, let me put it that way, is one that has been struggling with the issues you've just mentioned. Where do we place extractive industry in terms of accountability, in terms of transparency, and in terms of development for the countries that are endowed with these resources? Yes, yeah, he's right. The natural resources in Africa, they're huge, they're immense. 70% of cobalt, 90% of platinum, probably half of the gold reserves in the world is on the continent. But it's not just about the reserve. What has this reserve done for the people? And because of the divide and rule and the colonial and neo-colonial transitions that the continent has been through, there hasn't been an effective collective or collaborative response the way we've had in the oil sector, for example, when African countries involved in oil development and oil resources were able to form part of the OPEC cartel in the early 70s. That has not happened with the variety of minerals that we're dealing with. But it's not for lack of attempt on the part of the continental body. In 2009, the African Union came up with the African Mining Vision. And the African Mining Vision really focuses on ensuring that the industry leads to development rather than just extraction, by insisting on, first, infrastructure, second, local processing, and third, dealing with the illicit financial flows that have been largely promoted by the extractive sector. I mean, you may be aware of Thabo Mbeki's report in 2012 that on an average, on an annual basis, about $50 billion leaves Africa through illicit financial flows. And the bulk of these illicit financial flows actually is through the mineral sector. So for many African countries, they're looking for ways to ensure that these transitions from paternalism to partnership. And many of them are part of the various initiatives that have come up on accountability in the sector. EITI, for example, many African countries are members of the extractive industry transparency initiatives, looking at beneficial ownership, looking at the flow of finances in the sector, insisting on local processing in many of the countries affected, and addressing the corruptive tendencies that emanate from the lack of transparency that often attend mineral extraction on the continent. So clearly, these are issues that are of concern to African governments now, even more so than it used to be, partly because many of these mineral industries are no longer state-owned enterprises. They're mostly private sector owned or private sector led, but regulation has not met up with the transition to the private sector on the continent in many of these countries. Some are better developed, South Africa, Ghana, the gold industry there, and a few others, but by and large, the African mining vision itself has not been fully realized on account of these variegated and inconsistent policy responses on the part of the governments.
Thank you very much. I think it's all important points, and I want to turn to Mr. Kenny to ask. We have two different dimensions: the geopolitical dimension with external players, and then the African internal dimension with African players coming up, often underestimated. We call it African agency to actually set the rules, set the standards, wanting to set these standards. From an investor's perspective, what does the global race for minerals look like on the ground, and how do you actually also relate to these emerging African voices when it comes to regulating the mineral space?
Thank you, Maddalena, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you here today. Africa is undoubtedly endowed with an abundance of natural resources, and that gives it a critical place in the development of a global economy. Without several of these critical raw materials, they've been mentioned: cobalt, nickel, rare earths, graphite, etc. There will be no green transition. There will be no digital transition. Unfortunately, for Europe and the EU more generally, nature did not endow the EU with these minerals. You need to go where they're at. And something I've said to people in forums similar to these is that the Critical Raw Materials Act, I think probably everybody in this room has heard of the Critical Raw Materials, and I would stress the second word in that act, the R. It's the Critical Raw Materials Act. It's not the Critical Refined Materials Act, and it's not the Critical Recycled Materials Act. If you don't control the raw materials, you can't control the value chain. And this is what other countries have done very well, and the obvious elephant in the room is China. China's approach to building its own supply chain is to start at the beginning, and the beginning is mining. They own the entire value chain, and they recognize that they need to provide, well, it's obviously the way their government is run, they can provide, but they provide very strong central government financial assistance at the mining stage. They take very long-term views. They're not worried about getting a return on capital invested during their term in government. So they're playing chess. They're looking 2, 3, 4, 5 moves ahead. And that is what the West isn't doing. And I would say, I'm delighted that the CRMA came into force. I think it's a great piece of legislation, but as we sit here in September 2025, I don't believe the EU can meet its targets in 2030. It's simply too late. And let me put that in context for you. The average length of time to take a mineral project from exploration through to a mine is 20 years. And the number of projects that make it from exploration to a mine is 1 in 5,000. That's what you're dealing with here. So what the EU has done, what the US has done, is they have relied overly on private industry, on what are called junior companies, to put up the risk capital, to take the long-term view, and to try and be the pathfinder for a new value chain. And those sovereigns and supranationals then typically only tend to come in and support after, towards the back end of the 20 years, when everything has been proven and everything has been permitted and all the consultations have been done and all the mining standards have been adhered to, and then they come in. But what's happened is that 5-10 years before, the Chinese have bought it. The US have bought it. I think the balance and the fundamental change that we would like to see is actually more government involvement. Honestly, not around policy. Policy is necessary and it's in place, but it's very simple. Money. Where is the money? If you read the Critical Raw Materials Act, all 600 pages of it, you will not find any reference to the provision of funding. You will find a reference to facilitating access to funding. That's exactly what it says. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but this is the difference. So at this stage, decisive action need to be taken around finance. Support needs to be given to private companies who I think are shouldering a disproportionate amount of the risk. And in terms of trying to build a value chain, the reliance on the smallest party in the value chain actually delivering the entire solution to an industry, I think is a bit misplaced. But some good steps have been taken, but the key ones remain to be taken, and that is the more direct provision of finance, or, as been said by one of the speakers earlier, some type of government support in the form of pricing for these raw materials. And I'll just, to finish this, I'll give you one example. The US government, in July of this year, announced a deal where they have committed to buy 10-year output from a US rare earth producer who will build a magnet plant at double the current market price. I'm not saying you need to pay double, but it just is a statement of intent. That is the pull factor to develop an industry. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would love to have like a European reaction to this, to understand like what's the thinking. Maybe two questions around what you just said. The first is basically, it seems that Europe can find it difficult to go alone in this conversation. It can if it finds a way of channeling the right financial instruments. But one question to Mr. Cravinho is also if there is a thinking of cooperating with non-European partners with stronger mineral capacity. Can it be part of the solution rather than see them as zero-sum competitors? And what would make cooperation with these other players politically acceptable? You mentioned earlier diversifying also within Africa. There's a sentence that we've heard a lot in Europe, like-minded countries, working with like-minded countries. What does it actually mean? How can we pass the concept of making it politically acceptable to work with other international players? But a second question that I put out there for everybody, if you can unpack a little bit more this pricing idea for raw materials. What is actually needed and where is the thinking going from maybe all three of you, if you can unpack it a little bit more?
Great. Well, I think James has outlined how far behind we lag. There is simply no alternative but to be partnering with others. We do not have the luxury of saying we're going to do it our way. By the time we did it our way, everybody else, well, particularly China and others would be far ahead. So we have to even look at the opportunities of cooperation with China, although for obvious reasons in a manner that provides us with appropriate insurance in terms of dependencies and risk. But it's there. We need to look at what they're doing to see where our interests and theirs might converge. Gulf countries have enormous availability of capital and a desire to have a more global footprint, including in Africa, to which they're looking quite intensively. I think that we should be looking to partner with Gulf countries playing to the advantages of each, of us, of Africans, and of the Gulf countries themselves. Countries like Japan, Canada, like-minded, great at industrial integration, processing, but don't really have the scale. But certainly, we should be working with them because they will be partners in our interest, which is to promote global governance standards of the kind that you've been referring to quite rightly. But we shouldn't ignore that we're up against a difficult fight there because we are competing against those who are happy to undermine appropriate governance standards, because it gives them short-term advantages in terms of immediate deals, and it gives them longer-term advantages as well, because they can deal much better with situations where there are not appropriate governance mechanisms in place. So we need, of course, to be working with those with whom we can develop appropriate ESG standards, which ultimately will, of course, be much better for development promotion, for local value added, and for creating a business environment that is much more conducive to European interests. So looking to promote our interests in that wider sense, I think would have to be a central part of the kind of partnerships that we are willing to establish. We need to think strategically. And I think James has outlined from the perspective of business one of the major problems that we face. We have enormous difficulty in thinking strategically and at the same time working in a practical manner that is consequential with private business. We're quite good at developing good strategic thought pieces, but then there's the gap with those who are working in practical terms, the private companies, who obviously need to be a fundamental part of our answer. So we have a lot of work cut out for us, but at the same time, we need to be extremely active, I would say, in looking for partnerships where they're relevant and linking up the strategic thinking with the private business activities.
Thanks a lot. And now to Minister Fayemi, going back to this idea of partnerships and in general, like global players more and more interested in Africa because of the minerals. I mean, we see a lot of Africa strategies coming out of European capitals and beyond, and I think almost all of them have a mineral dimension. How can African leaders leverage these agendas, global agendas, the interests of other international players for their green transitions, for their defense industries, what we mentioned earlier? How can African leaders leverage these global interests to strengthen actually their geopolitical position? For example, gain more influence in global rule setting, reduce security risks, and so forth, and also how to manage these multiple players coming all at once, which inevitably will increase competition on the African continent.
Well, thank you. Well, for me, the only way to do that is through collaboration rather than competition. Ideally, those who are coming in want to come in on a case-by-case basis and on a country-by-country basis. And we're really not benefiting from that. Mining is a very, very capital-intensive sector. So access to capital, access to infrastructure, access to data are always critical to the countries involved. And more often than not, those who possess the expertise are not necessarily from Africa. On data, for example, we have an idea of what is everywhere, but in terms of seismic, specific data, it's often likely to be Europe or America or China. So, but if we're able to come together as Africans, probably Vehicle of African Union or the Economic Commission for Africa or the African Development Bank supported initiatives, contractually, we can negotiate a longer term arrangement, which would not necessarily bring the box immediately, but would allow those who want to come in, whether they're Chinese or Europeans, to bring the capital for patient capital now, because it's not going to realize immediate benefit, in a manner that can be structured for, mutual benefit. I think that's one area that a lot more work needs to be done by us as Africans and by our partners from wherever. The second relates to regulatory frameworks. I think we need a continental regulatory arrangement that would also help hold in check the opportunists who really want to come and take advantage of what is available on the continent. But that would only work if we have a very clear-cut collaborative initiative. Let's say cobalt or lithium. It should be possible, for example, for all the countries on the continent that are endowed with these initiatives, first to have a sense of what is there, and then to have a collaborative framework around how to engage external players and through them insist on local processing rather than exportation of raw materials. And then also collectively decide on pricing. OPEC was able to do that effectively for a very long time before you then got into OPEC Plus and got into other players coming on the scene. I think we're back there because as long as it's individually done, we're going to end up in situations we've seen in the Sahel lately with cancellation of contracts by the coup makers who came on the scene, with the Canadians in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and in a number of these, because the perception that Yao spoke about is very real on the ground, that external players are only just here to cheat Africans out of their own resources. And there has to be a way to address this without necessarily driving investors out of the continent.
Thank you. And one of the central points here is actually a challenge that also the Europeans face in coming together and setting up regulatory frameworks that can apply. We are two continents talking to each other, which is very different from Africa, China, Africa, UAE, and so forth. So it's multiple challenges. Let me turn to Mr. Kenny. From South Africa, where you operate, South Africa is the first country with which the EU is negotiating a clean trade and investment partnership. How is it working? How is the negotiation going? And what would a realistic Europe-Africa industrial partnership look like? What is the change that is needed to convince investors like you to scale up, or to support investors like you to scale up?
I can't tell you how the clean trade and investment partnership is going because I don't believe it's been finalized. The treaty hasn't been published, so other than the announcement last March, there's no more details. So we're as interested as you are. The headline number of 4.4 billion euros being available channeled through Global Gateway is also very welcome, but there is no detail. What projects will it be administered towards? Who will administer it? Is it grants? Is it loans? Is it equity? Is it guarantees? I've no idea. So again, the policy is fantastic. We welcome it. We look forward to it. But you know, on the ground, there's nothing in particular has happened. I think it will get there. And again, it probably comes back to the point from earlier. It's just the speed of movement. So going from the bilateral to the joint announcements to the negotiations. I'm not sure what timeline we're on, but I think it would be better if it moved faster. In the interim, again, what you're doing is you're coming back to relying on private industry. And private industry effectively taking a venture capital type approach. I mean, if we look at some of the best known and most valuable companies in the world, particularly around the tech sector, whether it be NVIDIA or Meta or Stripe or others who would be familiar to everybody here, they are mostly financed initially in their first few rounds by venture capitalists. And the approach of those venture capitalists, the best ones in the world, is to recognize that not everything you're going to invest in will succeed, and you're taking a portfolio approach. So you may look at 100 or 500 or 1,000, and you invest in 10. You aren't expecting 10 winners, 10 mines, 10 new drugs, 10 vaccines, but you're expecting that in the 10, you'll have 1 or 2 that will pay for the rest and will give you the result. This is the type of approach that needs to be taken now. So a wider disbursement of funding to still a selected group of projects. I think the Critical Raw Materials Act's criteria for application and selection were excellent. So I have no issue with the problem. I'm just saying at the back end of that, to turn the policy into action will require funding. And to pick up on your point about some of the panel made earlier, I absolutely agree. The days of Africa exporting, bulk commodities, unprocessed raw ore, are over. There must be beneficiation in country. You must pass on the benefits to the local community. Now, that can be challenging in some places where you have assets which are attractive at one level, but they're stranded. They're 1,000 kilometers from a port or from a railway, and that, to unlock those, needs government support in terms of bringing the infrastructure in place. So that's the joined-up thinking that's needed. I think from the if I call it the local government, it's infrastructure. I think it's from a supranational like an EU. It's funding and working hand in hand with the local government, and taking some risk. That's ultimately, I think, what will give the best result. Absolute clarity, I think, is needed around any pools of capital, who administers them, how they're administered, funding mechanisms and instruments. Clarity around that, I think, would encourage more private sector people to take that first step, knowing that if they get it to a certain point, then the support will come in. At the moment, I think that's not sufficiently clear.
Clear. Thank you very much. I think we can start opening the discussion to the floor. There's a lot of people here. I mean, I do have a number of follow-up questions, but let's see if there are urgent questions to be asked already. Yeah, so please, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Lisa Musho. I'm working for the International Crisis Group, and I had a question. There was already a lot of conversation about the competition for the African resources and how this is also an opportunity for Africans to leverage this, because of course this is also a lot of interest from global players and an opportunity for Africans to also choose who to partner with, right? So there's an opportunity side. But when we're looking at the sort of risks, especially when global tensions between big powers are rising, as we are discussing here in the Warsaw Security Forum at length. How do you see that also being sort of a risk that these kind of big power tensions are then replicated on the ground on the African continent? We see already conflicts like the conflict in Sudan, where regional power dynamics or tensions are kind of fueling the conflict. So how much do you see also sort of risk that competition ultimately sort of maybe leads to greater insecurity and greater tensions on the continent?
Thank you. We'll take another couple, please, here. Here, first.
Hello, my name is Viktoria Kowalczyk. I'm a Ukrainian lawyer who's working for Project Expedite Justice in Ukraine. We are mostly focused on agriculture, but in this regards, how would you save those deals, actually, if recently we've seen the situation when the African countries are trying to step out from the ICC coalition, and for so many years they are not actually satisfied with the work. So what are the guarantees, and how EU actually wants to support African countries? Because as we know, as the lessons from history shows us, where the resources are, there can be the situation quite a bit destabilized. So the same is in eastern Ukraine, like all the resources are concentrated there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we'll take one more there.
Thank you. Jędrzej Czerep, head of Middle East and Africa project at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. I'd like to follow up on the remarks of James Kenney on the changing approach of African governments towards mining deals, and that there's no way back to, taking raw materials out without sharing benefits. But we see cases like mining code in Mali, for example, where they did a hard bargaining when they raised up the percentage of royalties they want to take. They raised the percentage of state involvement in mining operations, and the result was very mixed. That the industry decried that. Some actors withdrew, like Australian Lithium. Others stepped in, like Chinese Ganfeng. So, is the industry really ready to adjust to the new rules of the game that are emerging?
Okay, thank you. Maybe one last here, and then we'll do a second round later here. So we cover all three sides with questions. Here.
Thank you so much. My name is Riaz Shanik from the Parliament of South Africa. I was lucky to attend the South African EU IPM, which was hosted by the South African Parliament earlier this year in Cape Town. And one outcome of this was to strengthen EU-South African cooperation on critical raw materials. And thus, a 4.7 billion euro financing package was announced to support mineral processing, green hydrogen, etc. Now, the question that I have is, how can we ensure that this investment and deals like this support Africa's own industrialization and energy security rather than reinforcing extractive or one-sided value chains? Thank you.
Okay, we'll stop here and take a second round later. Should I hand over to you first to start?
Thank you. Let me see if I can read my writing. So, actually, several of the questions raise a similar point or preoccupation, and which is the one of, to what degree is it possible to establish partnerships that are of interest for the African countries, that correspond to this sense of exploitation that the African youth has. And there, I think that what Minister Fayemi has been saying about the need for Africa-wide regulation, for the identification of appropriate practices that set standards. This is fundamental. I'm very conscious of the enormous challenges that are implied simply because of the tendency to undercut, and individual players can be seduced. And once a number of individual players are seduced, it's very difficult to establish that. Nevertheless, I think this is the only way. This is the only way to manage to incorporate mechanisms that allow for a good deal, one that focuses on local value incorporation and promotion of development in the countries which actually have the resources in their soil. On the question of the global geopolitical tensions, absolutely, very much impacting. And there is, because there was the reference also to the Mali mining code, there is some paradoxes involved in this, because we do have the demand for more royalties and so on. But at the same time, Wagner Group and now Africa Corps are being paid for how? Through concessions of mines, where there's no question of royalties. This is pure export of gold direct to Moscow. And so of the worst possible kind of exploitation as a result. So we, as Europeans, we as Westerners, I think also need to be shining the spotlight on the reality of mining practices in countries that claim to have a different approach.
Thank you. And Mr. Fayemi, would you like to come in?
I totally agree with the perspective put forward by João. You know, for African countries, I don't think we come into this from ideological grounds. Many African countries come into it from very practical perspective, and that's why there is a sense in which many, particularly in Europe, would feel that China is at an advantage, because China appears to link their desire for these minerals with at least a modicum of developmental agenda. So when they do the Belt and Road Initiative, which focuses largely on infrastructure, road, rail, to many of these regions where we have the raw materials, they obviously know that there's a benefit that will come from that. And I know Europe tried it too with America in the recent Lobito Corridor initiative. I mean, with the new government in America, one doesn't quite know where that's going to end, but at least I think there's a realization that you cannot just come into this purely with the intention of taking out without giving back. That is something that I believe it's getting to an acceptable position in many of these capitals. However, we do need, as Africans, to get our own act together. And that's why I keep emphasizing on a coordinated, collaborative strategy. As per what's going on in Sudan, Mali, DR Congo, it's a reality of power politics. It's not going to go away. And many of these countries are also not romantic about their intention, particularly the Gulf states. It's about how they can become critical political players on the ground, and this gives them an opportunity to do that. So you find some of the Gulf states supporting Hemeti, you find others supporting Boham, and you see the same thing in DR Congo. I guess it's still the same old power politics that we're dealing with, unfortunately.
Thank you. If I may just a point on this, on China's developmental role with infrastructure, which is absolutely true and it's undeniable. But at the same time, here we're talking about a further step, which is an industrial type of step, which China hasn't significantly contributed to. Nobody has to date in terms of external players. So this is
actually China seems to be doing more.
It
with
is
processing on the ground,
and that's a message also to Europe, which keeps talking about we want to do value addition in Africa with all the complexities of that, because we are the only ones offering that, and that's not true. China is learning fast and is stepping up its approach. It was just a comment on this, because yes, infrastructure is not enough anymore in 2025. And over to you for comments.
I'll sort of try and blend an answer to two or three of those questions into one. It's a question about more generally African countries and, you know, the shifting sands and taxation and royalties going up and that being off-putting for investors. I absolutely agree. You wouldn't buy, you know, an apartment if you didn't know that you had the right to driving off the road, or what the tax would be, or, you know, that you actually owned it when you paid for it. So clarity around, you know, security of tenure, that you own what you think you own, around the fiscal regime that applies, and that it must be government guaranteed. That can't change just because someone wants to at the stroke of a pen because you've invested $100 or $200 or $500 million. So that's one thing, I think, where there are some very poor examples in Africa of governments, you know, really taking extreme positions and have killed their industry. And in some African countries, looking for more than 50% local ownership, you know, and that's a poison pill. To tie it into the question asked about South Africa, I think South Africa, where our company's developing our rare earth project, South Africa has a very well-developed mining code. It's well understood. It's got a very long-established mining industry. It's well accepted by international investors, and there's absolute clarity. And one of the things that it does very well is that in order to secure a mining right, you need to do, well, there's a lot of things you need to do, but two of the things that you need to do is you need to develop a social and labor plan, which basically is going to show how you uplift the local communities. And you can't just write one and file it and saying, well, I've done one. I know in the case of our company, our consultation alone over 2 years involved 243 separate consultation meetings with nearly 2,500 people locally. There was no one left to consult with. So you get them to buy in and understand that there's going to be a massive and tangible benefit to them, not just in the creation of jobs, not just in the creation of infrastructure, secondary jobs, housing being built, et cetera, But the other area which South Africa does very well, it requires economic participation, but are what are referred to as HDSAs, historically disadvantaged South Africans. And so, I mean, that's broader than black, if I can put it in that terms. It's a much wider range of people. And they need to have an economic participation of 26% in a project. So it's very simple, you know, whether you like it or don't like it, the rules are very clear. If you do what's required, you'll get your permit, you can operate sensibly. And I think I'd applaud it. And I think other African countries could learn from South Africa. As far as a specific question about the money which was announced, that 4.4 billion from Global Gateway, we're all waiting for the memo. Where is it? What is it? Yes, it'll support vaccines. Yes, it'll support green hydrogen. Yes, it'll support critical raw materials. But who, when, where, how, and what aren't yet, well, I'm not aware of what they are yet, but it's a first step, and hopefully that'll come. And sorry, to tie in with the question about Ukraine, not that I know very little about Ukraine, but in the same thing, if you're trying to encourage industry to go into an area which may have other challenges, security. I mean, I'm involved in another project of our company, which is in Mozambique. That project is currently under force majeure because of an Islamic insurgency. Now, you go to a Western investor and you can talk about risks, about capital overruns, about commodity price, about, you know, interest rates. Islamic insurgency is not the normal risk that a Western investor expects to be trying to, you know, quantify in their head. But that said, so long as there's sufficient upside to address the risk, people will come in. Clarity around, you know, tenure, fiscal regime, ability to operate, how you can suspend your operations, declare force majeure if there is something outside of your control, I think you can overcome a lot. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Very helpful, and also, in a way, of course, like Africa is seen often as a continent of conflict, and there are conflicts, but we don't have many alternatives in Europe than just like dealing more with the continent and managing those risks. The alternative is not avoiding the risks, is managing them. Quick round, second round of questions. We only have like 5 minutes. Ambassador.
Thank you so much. A quick one, and thank you to the panel. I'm called Ushaka, Ambassador of Rwanda to Poland. I just have a question. Listening to the panel, specifically to the CEO and Minister Kayode, I have the impression that between Africa and Europe, we have a disconnect. There is a disconnect in terms of policy dialogue and policy mindset. And I'm referring to what CEO said. There are some policy declared, but I don't know where things are, how to make it practical. And Kayode saying from paternalism to partnership. And my question is, do you think that a win-win policy mindset, especially in Europe, towards Africa, is it possible? Isn't the central piece? And secondly, do we have a few companies from Europe that are doing actually what we would like to be seen, that are investing in extraction and processing in Africa? Is there a way from Europe to scale up those best practices so that to widen? Because I have the impression when we talk about critical materials, the narrative I have been hearing here in Europe is concerns about China, about Russia, and not really about what Africa wants. Since African Union is saying, here we have the Mining Act, have we taken time to look into that and find a dialogue with the continent instead of saying, but China might be coming? So I think the win-win mindset has not yet come. I don't know if I'm right, but maybe we'll enlighten it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on the floor? No, I don't see any. Okay, so for you to answer.
Thank you very much. And just very quickly, I think the ambassador of Rwanda has made an extremely important point. We heard, and I have no doubt that he's quite right, James talking about the need for access to finance, for investment possibilities for private companies. But we need also to have a massive investment of political capital in the relationship between Africa and Europe. There is, when you mentioned the disconnect, it exists. I see it daily in my own work. And the only way of going beyond it is to deepen a dialogue which is extremely superficial. Africa has changed enormously in the last couple of decades. Europe has also changed greatly, and yet we talk to each other in the same way as we did 20, 30 years ago, donor-beneficiary, this old aid relationship, which is completely anachronistic. So we need to be investing much more in listening to each other, understanding what the dynamics are in each of our continents. I firmly believe that Africa is, it's our neighbor, but it's also very much part of our future if only we learn to work a lot better than we have done in the recent past.
I couldn't agree more with you, Ambassador. It's a disconnect that is almost bordering on resignation, in my view. And that resignation then manifests itself in a conversation that is mediated almost purely by migration rather than any other thing. And it's unfortunate. Europe knows Africa more than the competitors that Europe has in Africa, and should take advantage of that. Yes, there are historical challenges with that knowledge of colonialism and neocolonialism, but therein lies the opportunity for autonomous engagement as well, which we're not having enough of beyond the superficial dialogues between the EU and specific African countries. I think it's time for such frank, because Africans are not engaging China because they love China. If you ask the average African who or which part of the world they would rather deal with, many of them will point in the direction of Europe. Not China, not the Gulf states. But unfortunately, there is a perception that Europe doesn't want to even hear anything about Africa. So Africans feel, well, we neither face East nor do we face West. As Kwame Nkrumah told us years ago, let's just face forward. Where can we find the best engagement that will bring better development for our country and our continent? That's what defines what's going on now. And it could be better addressed by much more comprehensive dialogue leading to development rather than migration-focused dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. We ran out of time, but I'll leave you 30 seconds to comment.
Well, the only thing I'd add to that is I fully agree. I don't think there's maybe as big a disconnect as you might think. I think actually the gap is quite close, but it's just the will to close it. And I also, in the same way that we talk about the EU and Africa, the EU isn't a place and Africa isn't a place. So actually what I see is that there will probably be, more direct and tangible engagement happening with individual EU countries and individual African countries rather than it being a continent-to-continent embrace.
Thank you very much. We ran out of time and we need to close here, but there's a lot of takeaways. To end on a positive note, there are a lot of complementarities, historical complementarities, and maybe the gap isn't that big as we think, but we need to actually be able to close it. So ahead to the next EU-AU summit in Luanda in a couple of months, and hopefully more strategic partnerships between countries in Europe and countries in Africa. Thank you very much to all for listening and joining, and have a good day.